let's go ahead and get kicked off. Hopefully everybody here is for technical session 9B, titled Transportation Management Response to COVID-19. If you are looking for the session labeled VMT, MOT, and Diversion Study, you're in the wrong session, but please stay. I think you'll have a great time here. I'll be your moderator, Campbell. I am with AECOM, where I serve as the North Carolina Traffic and ITS Department Manager. And speaking of AECOM, they are our sponsor today. So 1 second, and I will load up the video. So one thing I didn't think to test beforehand was the audio. I know the audio of these things are always kind of a little sketchy. So if you didn't hear it, that's okay. Again, thank you to my employer AECOM for sponsoring this session. Definitely want to thank our panelists today for being online and all you attendees that have already signed in. A few ground rules, just real quick, just kind of wanted to go through. Each of our presenters has 20 minutes to present. And then after each session, we will allow 5 minutes worth of questions before we go on to the next session. This will allow us to have questions and answers after each session, so you don't have to try to remember until the end, and will help us get through this. We do have a few minutes at the very end of the speakers if we all keep everything on schedule. So if we do get to the time and there's any remaining time left in our session, I jokingly told someone else I was just going to start playing Clemson football reels, but not really, so don't worry. But with that, we'll go ahead and dive into our first presenter. I'll read a little bit about Chris. So our first presenter is Chris Melson. He will be speaking on COVID-19 impacts on local transportation agency operations, and that's a national review with illustrative examples from Louisiana agencies. Chris is the local program manager of LTAP, which provides training and technical assistance to local public works and transportation agencies across Louisiana. Previously, Chris managed Transit, a transportation research center involving 11 academic institutions across 5 states, including Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. He also worked for FHWA at the Turner Fairbank Highway Research Center, where he helped develop and manage their traffic analysis, modeling, and simulation research program. So with that, I will hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, France. Just want to double check if everyone can see my screen and hear me okay.
I can see your screen okay. Graham, oh, and one other thing I meant to say earlier, I would be remiss without saying is we also have an SDITE host person on the call if we have any issues. And I'd like to thank Graham Malone with HDR for his help. Graham, can you see the screen okay?
Yeah, sure can. Thanks, France.
Okay, thank you, Chris. You can take it away.
Great. Well, it's certainly a pleasure to present at this virtual annual meeting. This is actually my first time presenting at a Southern District ITE annual meeting, and I hope to participate in future meetings that will be hopefully, of course, in person. As mentioned, my name is Chris Melson. I am the program manager of Louisiana Local Technical Assistance Program, the Louisiana LTAP, which is a partnership between LSU, the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, and FHWA, and we're housed within the Louisiana Transportation Research Center here on the campus of LSU. In my presentation, I will be about a study that we are currently conducting. And the purpose of the study is threefold, which is kind of, summarized in the title of the presentation. One is to identify common challenges that were faced by local transportation and local public works departments during the COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery. And so I think this is a little bit different from what everyone's kind of been talking about in terms of COVID-19 impacts. I'm actually looking at the impacts to the agency operations, so not traffic operations. So again, number one is to identify common challenges faced by these agencies, of course, how these challenges were overcome, and to summarize the lessons learned. And we're doing that in three ways. One, of course, is conducting a literature review. And so we've looked at the other surveys, actually the other LTAPs have done, other documentation that other national agencies have done. And that's pretty much done. In fact, what I'll be presenting is the findings from that literature review primarily. Secondly, we are disseminating an electronic survey to our stakeholders, and we just sent that out. So also in the presentation, I'll have some preliminary analysis results, but those are definitely not final results. And what we're also doing is conducting one-on-one interviews, really to gain more information about their experiences and really to get at how these challenges were overcome and the main lessons learned. The output, hopefully, of this study is a document summarizing everything I just mentioned, but also to provide recommendations to these agencies to hopefully better prepare them for such a major disruption in the future. And really the motivation behind this study, as I kind of hinted at, was there's a lot of studies on the impacts COVID-19 has on, on transportation system performance. So on safety, on traffic operations, on traveler behavior, and all of that's, of course, important. In fact, it was great to see several sessions of this annual meeting dedicated to that. But what also is important, of course, is how these agencies are operating and how they are continuing their services that they can. And that's definitely something that's worth studying. And I felt that there was a gap. To provide a little bit of context before going through some of identifying the common challenges. So in the presentation, essentially I'll provide is the common challenges that were essentially in the survey, and going through the survey is a good way to identify those common challenges. As I mentioned, we're still doing the survey and we're still doing the interviews. So results are essentially forthcoming. But before presenting that information, I want to provide a little bit of context of these municipalities that I'm talking about. And here in Louisiana, it's estimated that we have 335 municipalities, including 65 cities, 111 towns, 159 villages. And the way that Louisiana defines those is by population, a city being over 5,000 population, a town between 5,000 and 1,000, and a village between 1,000 and 300. And so I wanted to present this just to see there's going to be a lot of course, variety way that these agencies operate before COVID-19, how they're organized and really their purview. And so those municipalities, in addition to those, we also have 64 parishes. So you can imagine that the impacts that COVID had on them, of course, will also be quite diverse. And not even looking in the US. So it's estimated there's 19,400 municipalities in the US as well. So again, just imagine the great variety of the way that these agencies operate and the potential impacts that COVID could have on their operations. A little bit more context for our main stakeholders and what we'll solicit the survey to in conducting the interviews as well are will be city engineers, for example, and also public works departments, mainly parish public works departments. And I just wanted to kind of show, of course, the critical services that they all perform, and that streets and the maintaining of the roadways is really just one facet of the services that they provide. And also wanted to kind of highlight the variation in staff. As I mentioned, kind of the more professional staff, the engineering folks, the technical folks. We also have administrative staff. And actually some of the highlights I'll be talking about is really the field staff, field crews, which again is really a high population, but not population, a high staff within these public works. And also sometimes they supplement, of course, some of the work with temporary workers as well. So again, you can imagine how COVID-19 has impacted these different staff types. So I think a good way, as I mentioned, to kind of talk about these common challenges that were faced by these agencies is actually for everyone to go through the survey, which does a pretty good job of summarizing what I saw in the literature review. So I do encourage everyone right now, please kind of still pay attention to me, but to go and conduct this survey. Again, you'll hear me talking about it, and you'll also be reading it. So hopefully comprehension will be high. So I'm going to put in this website in the chat. So go to that website, pinu.umu.com. I just put it in there, and then enter this PIN 587-34525. And excuse me for 1 second. I have to launch it first. So let me launch that survey. And hopefully you all will be able to start conducting that. And hopefully by the end of today as well, at the end of the presentation, we actually go over the results and kind of show maybe there's differences in what the group that we have here versus what we've seen so far in our research. And I'll try to monitor the chat too if there's any issues with the survey. It's not critical, but I think it hopefully it'd be fun, right? As fun as engineers can get. So before moving on, actually, so we categorize the main common challenges in this way: staffing challenges, primarily maintaining a consistent, sizable workforce; procedural, really implementing the new safety protocols and other protocols; acquisition, which is not only referring to acquiring PPE for their staff, but also other materials that they required for their normal operation. Again, these folks are out there in the field, maintaining the roadways, cutting grass, cleaning ditches and culverts. And so there's equipment involved as well. And materials. And so really some of them had great difficulty in getting those materials really during the height of the pandemic. And of course, budget, the way that they've handled issues with a shortfall in potential sales tax revenue and other tax revenue, or maybe just an actual budgetary cuts as well. So I'll go through each of these in more detail. Again, please continue doing the survey. I appreciate that. So for staffing, again, this is also in the survey, some of the challenges, really the difficulties involved in maintaining a consistent workforce. On the right here is the results of our survey. Again, I would not pay that much attention to these results as they will change definitely as we get more folks involved in the survey. And essentially, if they identify this staffing as a significant challenge that they faced, this is the percentage of the difficulty essentially that they had in making staffing a significant challenge. So essentially, if there's difficulty in determining which staff is essential, again, 40% of them mentioned that. I would like to point out a few of these: modifying staff schedules to limit in-person interaction. Of course, I think we've all are doing that or have done that or maybe still doing that. I think a lot of the professional folks, of course, worked from home and teleworked, and sometimes at the beginning, maybe they had in-person schedules where they're off 1 week or off 1 day to limit the capacity of the buildings. But again, for field work, that was, again, quite a big challenge. And a lot of them had difficulties maintaining social distancing with the amount of vehicles that they had. So some agencies is one person per vehicle. Typically, that's not how they would operate. So that was a difficulty definitely faced. Some overcome that in a variety of ways. One is actually modifying the work that they were doing, and so that they didn't need as many people in a certain area for the specific thing, but kind of dividing and conquer, maybe doing more maintenance tasks where there's a few folks involved versus some of the major projects. I would also like to point out this inability to hire due to hiring freeze. Hiring freeze, again, was a very common way to deal with potential budget cuts, and were enacted pretty quickly during the pandemic. What's kind of interesting about, again, the public works folks is that there was already great difficulty, really, in maintaining and hiring appropriate staff at public works departments. Typically, sometimes that's because of low wages. So here in Louisiana, there's a couple agencies that already mentioned that even when there weren't hiring freeze, there are several employees, frankly, that would rather stay at home and have the relief checks versus working. Again, you wouldn't really think of that sometimes, but in this area with the field workers, that was definitely an issue for several agencies. Even some agencies enacting hiring freezes, then lifting them. For example, there was a Colorado agency that had 6 positions, and once it opened, they couldn't actually hire those 6 positions. They could only hire 2 that were actually had quality applicants. Procedural. I guess I mentioned this was essentially, again, implementing new safety protocol and the challenges involved in that. Again, don't pay too much attention to these preliminary results here. But a couple highlights is, of course, effectively communicating these protocols to staff. I'm sure everyone here had issues with that, or that, again, a constant and consistent communication was critical during COVID-19. But again, for the field folks, that was also quite difficult to communicate. Again, they don't have offices, they don't have computers, they don't have email addresses, work email addresses. So to communicate constantly changing protocol to them, again, was a significant challenge. And also, again, this is pretty high currently, but ensuring these protocols were being followed, again, a great challenge. As I mentioned before, some agencies enacted where there's only one person in a vehicle, and that really cut down on the efficiency of the work that we're able to do. So actually monitoring those protocols and ensuring that they were being followed, again, it was quite difficult during the pandemic. And acquisition, I'm sure all of you have heard the great difficulty in acquiring PPE right when the pandemic started and the shutdown started. In fact, just to highlight an example again from a Colorado agency, really tragic, to be quite honest with you, again, had great difficulty in acquiring PPE for their staff. So that person essentially went to their social media network and solicited donations, and people out of the goodness of the heart donated PPE so that agency could have staff and that they could be protected. So again, really don't, people talked about that right at the beginning, but that was definitely a challenge and definitely impacted operations. As I mentioned briefly in the introductory portion of the presentation, this is not just about acquiring PPE. The Cornell Local Roads Program, the New York LTAP, had a survey, and there were several agencies, and I could quote 10 of them off the top of my head, where there's difficulties in getting materials and equipment, especially if the equipment's had to be shipped in, and that caused significant delay in their projects. So that was, again, getting parts for repair and for their typical operations, again, was a challenge. It wasn't just acquiring typical PPE. And this is, of course, about the budget. And essentially, these are potential activities that an agency could do to address a budget cut. What's kind of interesting here, that even in the low amount of participants we currently have in the survey, all of these were enacted. So even eliminating staff positions, that of course did occur here in Louisiana at several agencies. A couple things to point out that maybe again that I learned, for example, and which is referring to kind of the staff more than the budget, but some of the activities at these agencies are provided by inmate work by inmates, or by temporary workers. So of course that workforce was essentially was gone. They couldn't do that typical work, or they had to do that in a different way. So that was another main impact, that those temporary workers weren't actually available. And really at the beginning of the pandemic and shutdown, a lot of these agencies had to essentially stop new major projects, delay those new major projects, and really focus on the work that they had then. Again, several quotes from these agencies. They had to cancel a few projects due to budget cuts. The town board asked me not to start any new road projects, had to cut some road projects due to funding shortfalls. This seemed to be getting better over time, but again, that's still a big challenge and still impacting their operations currently. And so to kind of summarize again, these are very preliminary results. This just shows essentially the percentage of the survey participants that identified staffing or procedural, these things as a significant challenge, again, related to impacting their operations. The diamond is indicating the percentage of folks that identify this as the most significant challenge. So as you can see, staffing and procedural, implementing new protocols, I think will likely be the top challenges faced by these agencies. I'm going to get more information in. All right, I don't have that much time. I have just 2 minutes left. So unfortunately, I don't think we can look at the results of the survey, but I appreciate you conducting those that did. And what's kind of nice in this program, I could also share it in a web page, all the results. So after a while, I'll share that in the chat. But to wrap up, I'm almost at the end of my time, so I apologize. Some of the lessons learned, I only have a couple minutes left, but of course, communication was critical. Consistent over communicating was critical, not only to their staff, but also to the public. Again, these public works departments providing public services. And in fact, essentially the public demanded that these services be uninterrupted. So just imagine all these challenges that these agencies are facing, but they still have to maintain that level of service. And that's one of the lessons learned that I've learned, is really to appreciate the public works departments, especially during the pandemic. They are, again, one of the heroes. Another thing, just to wrap up here, one of the surveys that we just did, actually, one of the lessons learned by the agency, they said to have compassion. They now have more compassion, essentially, for their staff and their coworkers, and kind of to realize all the things that maybe be going on outside of work that may be impacting work. And I think that's true for really a lot of folks here that got through the pandemic. We're still getting through the pandemic. So wrapping up, the final results will be available. Actually, I'm going to be presenting it at the annual ITE meeting just in a few months. So if you want to, if you're attending, you can mark your calendars and hopefully attend. And again, there'll be a lot more survey results, finalized results, and also more experiences from Louisiana, and also, again, providing recommendations for better preparation in the future. So if you do have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them now, I think. France, is that correct?
Yep,
but
that's
anyway, thank
correct,
you very much.
Chris. Yeah, thank you, Chris, for following through with the time limits. You did a great job there and really enjoyed your presentation. I do see one question in from Stephen Strength. I'll read that one for everybody. Did you have, oh, and by the way, if you have questions, you can enter them now. Otherwise, or you could raise your hand or something if you would like to ask it verbally, and I can try to turn on your audio. But from Stephen Strength, he asked, did you have any indication that agencies had difficulty accessing essential training such as onboarding and safety, especially virtual training?
That is a great question. In fact, again, for our LTAP and the other LTAPs, we primarily provide training, of course, and technical assistance, as the name suggests. And so again, these field workers, they didn't go home. They were out in the field working, again, providing those critical services. And so for us, for example, engineers or other professionals, virtual training was quite easy to come by. In fact, this was quite easy, this annual meeting, and the organizers did a great job where we can access it from, again, our offices or from our home offices. But again, a lot of these people couldn't do that. In fact, again, because of the staffing issues, they didn't have time for training. So yeah, there was a great difficulty for these agencies to get training. And that's just kind of why LTAP, for us, we try to get out there, train those folks in person where they actually can be trained as soon as we could. But yeah, that was definitely a difficulty, absolutely.
Okay, I am scrolling through the chat. I see no little hands raised. I do have a question, actually. First off, I'd say I like that you mentioned compassion at the end. And I think that is something that, and I'm glad that's something they took away. I think that's something hopefully we all can personally take away from COVID. What is the main thing you say you learned or would take away from this review? And what surprised you the most, Chris?
Oh, that's great. I think it kind of speeded up this thing, but one of the, again, main lessons learned really was I really didn't think about these public services, trash collection, utilities, everything like that. Those were truly uninterrupted for me, and something I didn't really think about. But then going through all the challenges that these folks had to face to provide that uninterrupted was a great appreciation, really, for me. The most interesting thing or surprising thing that I found, well, honestly, was the specific example of that person essentially having to go to their social network to get the proper PPE.
Wow.
And that's tragic, frankly.
That is.
That was probably, one of the surprising things. And also, let's leave it there. I'll make sure we have plenty of time for the other presenters.
No, I think that's really good. And I think that's a good point about the services like that, because I think back to the pandemic now, and it's not like my trash was never collected. It was always out there. I put it out there on Thursdays and it was always collected. So it's a lot of those services did have to go on. So it's well, Chris, thank you again for your presentation. Definitely appreciate you and your time spending on this, and we look forward to the annual meeting, seeing the full report. So, all right. Well, with that, we will move on to our next presenters. Next up is the presentation titled Planning for Curb Management. And that presentation will be given by Nick Mazzenga and Kenneth Smith. And I'll go ahead and read a little bit about them. Nick is a parking technology consultant with Kimley Horn. He serves on IPMI's technology committee and is passionate about leveraging technology to improve transportation infrastructure. Nick earned his bachelor's and master's degree in civil engineering from the Virginia Military Institute and the University of Virginia, respectively. He is also an Eno Transportation Foundation Fellow. In his free time, Nick enjoys running and spending time with his family and his beloved dog named Parker. And now Kenneth, he is a parking technology consultant at Kimley Horn as well. His specialty focus areas include parking access and revenue control, and also parking guidance system design and testing, including multiple technology installations at airports and municipalities. Kenneth earned his bachelor's degree from NC State. Kenneth also is the technical lead for ITS for Nick's site. Kenneth is a project engineer on ITS design and operations projects. And with that, I will hand it over to Nick and Kenneth.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. So first of all, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the presentation and this session. As mentioned, today we want to talk a little bit about curb management. And one of the things that we want to leave with you is an overview, not only about curb management, but also about the parking industry and how the curb management sector, how things have changed in the past year. We also want to spend some time discussing some of the future of this technology and share our thoughts on some of the parking industry and the impact, both positive and negative, due to COVID-19. So before we dive further into the parking industry and talk about curb management, we just want to talk a little bit about the parking ecosystem and just show some of the differences between the on-street and the off-street. So the on-street parking, they're very different from one another. So the on-street and off-street both work in a cohesive ecosystem that enhances the transportation experience. So to ensure a properly functioning parking system, the on-street and off-street parking should include some of the following elements. So on the on-street, it's ideal. We know that on-street is ideal for short-term parking, and the higher costs reflect the value of the easier access. There's also higher turnover rates for on-street parking to increase the parking availability. On-street can also be characterized by increased rates and fines to promote parking compliance. While when you talk about the off-street parking, it's more ideal for long-term commuter-style parking, characterized by lower hourly rates that enable longer-term sessions. In an off-street parking environment, you also have lower parking turnover rates, and that's fine. That's acceptable. There are ways to also have like pre-booking, yield management for large events, and they provide an opportunity to help increase the parking efficiency. So just before we continue a little bit further, if there's one basic takeaway from anyone that can leave from today, is that there are major distinctions, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about why the curb is so important and why we need to work a little bit more on it compared to the off-street facilities. So with that, I'll pass it up to Nick so he can share a little bit more about the principles of the on-street parking and curb management.
Thank you, Kenneth. Appreciate it. So yeah, let's talk more about the on-street side of things. And the big takeaway here regarding curb management and on-street parking is this foundational principle that you see here on the screen, because at its very, pure foundation, on-street parking and curb management, it seeks to ensure, very equitable access to the curb for all the roadway users. It's the foundational principle. So you really got to understand that equitable access to the curb. And by taking a very holistic view of the land uses and the demand for accessing the curb, you also have to consider the strategic reallocation of curb space. It can be made to kind of ensure people have much more safe and easy access to the places they want to go. So, just keep this in mind as we're going through this presentation. Moving forward, the main purpose of on-street parking, you have this understanding of what the on-street foundational principle is now. I want to give an overview of that parking ecosystem and dive further into the purpose of on-street parking. Those four main purposes that we show here are as follows. So on-street parking, it should support the businesses surrounding it by creating that parking turnover. You want to help facilitate that. And also on-street parking, it should generate revenue to fund a municipal's mobility goals. That's a really important one as well. It is an asset. And then on-street parking, it should also help facilitate commercial and passenger loading to kind of support that business, those business entities around it. And then lastly, point number 4, on-street parking, it's got to promote transportation demand management goals. So you want to use that as your lever, your tool to help promote those demand management goals. And if you look really closely at these 4 items, none of these, to talk about the COVID related things, none of these have really drastically changed in the past year. Now, certain items like revenue generation, I'll be honest, they've been down, like they've really been down, and we can all expect that. But there are still revenues to be collected at the same time. We could spend all day, honestly, a whole semester of school talking about the economics behind parking and that true cost of parking, but we'll leave that for another day. The importance of appropriately pricing the curb, I think that's just a takeaway here. It really needs to reflect that true value of the curb, because at the critical, that purpose is you want to allow a municipality to further promote their transportation demand management goals. And one way to do that is appropriately pricing the curb. So next, I want to talk about kind of the components of curb management. I want to give great credit to NACTO for putting together this figure. They've done a really good job at kind of documenting some of these elements if you haven't seen this already. So curb management, it's emerging as this critical element, especially in municipalities. There is a very, very rapid growth for TNC use, and then that expansion into multiple markets for curb space management. Kenneth and I spend a lot of time working with municipalities, but we also work with others who have curb space management issues. Airports, hotels, they're also feeling the brunt. Take, for example, any airport in the US pre-COVID, and just sit there and observe the Uber, Lyft pickup and drop off lines. And yes, they were a mess. There was always a need for some better curb space management there. And as I mentioned before, pricing for the curb, it's going to change. I think we're going to see, and we already are seeing, a lot more dynamic pricing for curb space. And pun intended, this is a terrible dad joke, to curb demand. That's what we're trying to do. You're also going to see a lot more flexible use spaces in the curb. As this figure shows, I mean, the curb has become the latest parking area of discussion. I can't go anywhere without any parking conference where we don't talk about curb space management. And how you manage that curb is now an even bigger part of a municipality's parking responsibilities. Yeah, they just have to collect the revenues, but now they're actually have some competing demands with that. And with the rapid growth of just gig economy meal delivery services, Uber Eats, Grubhub, Amazon Prime Now deliveries, there's this increase in competing interest for that access to the curb because everyone wants that very speedy pickup drop off. There's been a number of cities that have undergone a curb management pilot. Most recently, I was working with the city of Seattle, and we were rolling out a pilot curb management system where what they were doing is they were just creating a new policy to develop around their commercial vehicle loading zones. And one thing that we need to be cognizant of is that the existing curb asset, it is just that. It's an asset. It has value. There's a monetary thing tied to it. So we've recently had to have a lot of really tough conversations and discussions with some of our clients and our partners about this because there's this shift away from taking that, that revenue generating asset that was once here on the curb, and then repurposing that asset into something that may very well indirectly generate revenue, but it's recognized in a different way, such as an increase in tax revenue for a local business. So as you can see here on the figure, at one time there was a lot of curb space out there for parking and a lot of revenue generation, but as you move forward, there's other elements that are being introduced to that curb that may take away some of that. So moving on then, COVID-19 and curb management. Over the last year and a half, and I say year and a half, I've been closely tracking, kind of the impacts related to COVID-19 and the parking industry, because we realized, pre-COVID, there was actually a lot of building blocks in the parking technology ecosystem, as I call it, that already supported what I call frictionless or touchless systems that now COVID demands. And I mentioned the word frictionless. I'm going to say that a couple more times, and Kenneth will probably mention frictionless a couple more times. But in essence, this frictionless is that panacea of parking where everything just happens automatically. You don't need to lift a finger to initiate or end a parking session. You just kind of drive up. Money comes out of your wallet magically, and you just pay for everything, and everything works seamlessly. So as the year progressed, we kind of saw example after example where the pandemic actually positively impacted our culture and operating practices, and it accelerated the adoption and acceptance of some of these frictionless technologies in the parking industry. So this is kind of a testament to how well the parking industry had been moving in that direction of frictionless or touchless parking and adapting even before our world got totally flipped upside down. And I think from a technology standpoint, a lot of parking technologies that were once options or extras or these fancy little whiz-bang things, they were very quickly accelerated into widespread adoption and deployment. And I feel like a lot of those technologies are now here to stay. So as I mentioned before, the technology is here and everything is ready to go. And it's already there to support and optimize curb management strategies in our new COVID world that demanded so much touch-free, hands-free technologies. The parking technology industry, it had all the makings of this touchless parking experience, where many municipalities and parking operators had been on the fence. And like I said, it just kind of accelerated that adoption and acceptance. And in a municipal environment, some of the overarching challenges with curb management is that it can sometimes be very difficult to get drivers to initiate a transaction. I mean, everyone on this call has probably been there. The thought of, I'm only going to be here a few minutes, I don't need to pay, that comes into your mind and it comes into play every single time. So that ability to enforce and to respond in 15 to 30-minute timeframes or even shorter in high turnover area on-street environments, that's very tough. It's a really tough thing to do. And communication and outreach to like those small delivery companies, it can be cumbersome too, because there's a lot out there. So everyone kind of needs to get on board and be aware that this is one of the more challenging areas. As I mentioned, enforcement can be challenging for curb management. Either you have a ton of infrastructure out there, so lots of cameras, lots of electrical connections to devices out there that monitor the curb, or you have really high frequency patrolling and enforcement, which is also costly. So you have this balance of like, well, if I want to have a really well enforced curb, do I pay a lot for enforcement, or do I pay a lot for technology that's out there? And this is something that, you know, a lot of us are really challenged by. And in the municipal environment, there will always be that need for payment type equity. It's flat out, you need to do that. It's really important. And with the understanding that a public entity is typically bound to a requirement of providing that payment option for the unbanked. And I always like to harp on that. There is always a need to have that other payment option out there. And this sometimes though goes kind of in conflict with a frictionless parking environment, or that easily seamless curb space management infrastructure. So it's something that is still being worked on. There's no perfect solution yet, but it's still an issue that is being addressed. So now I want to hand it back to Kenneth, and he's going to talk more about some of the components of a successful parking program.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So now let's talk a little bit. And so now that we know that the technology exists and all of that is there, so how can we create a successful parking program? So the first item for managing curbs effectively is to talk about the customer experience, giving the options for the customer, prioritizing their needs. Think about options for parking, how to pay, or even giving them like fair pricing. Could be ways to make sure to have an effective parking program. It's also really important to work on the marketing for the parking programs and communicating rules so there are no surprises for the users. This is something that we see every now and then, that there are some rules and they're not really displayed or marketed anywhere, and then the users get surprises and people get mad about it. Then another important part of a parking program is technology and data analytics. And this is something that's often overlooked part of parking. We know that there are costs, and we've seen in the industry that some people are comfortable with the older systems, just having the regular pay station for one space or multiple spaces. And they have often overlooked the possibility of expanding operations and how we see parking. With current technology, you can actually enhance your customer experience. You can monitor activity in real time, increase contactless payments, and even be able to use data from reports to determine new programs and more efficient ways to manage parking. One of the main things that we noticed from some clients that we have worked with is that with new technology, sometimes they're offered with like 100 different reports that can be exported. You have all this data that can be queried, filtered, and arranged in any way so they can use it. And this data is often gets overlooked, and they could actually be using it a little bit more to expand their parking programs. Then we talk more about compliance and adjudication. Probably the part that customers like the least. No one likes to get a ticket, but at the same time, it's integral for the curbside management program. It needs to be a compliant system. It's important that between all parties, they have to respect each other's limits and make customers comply. We have seen several instances in cities that vehicles not pay for parking, and you know that you're not going to get caught. So in order to have a successful program, there needs to be constant monitoring of it from the both sides. Customers, they need to know the rules, they need to know their limitations, they need to know what things are right and what things are wrong. And at the same time, you also need to provide them with a real system that also allows them to like appeal citations or have some exceptions. Like you also need to understand that there are going to be some circumstances and that you're not going to be that strict. Then we go a little bit more on the revenue collections, which, I mean, it's a really important part. You need to make sure that the system is collecting revenue accurately and that the system is audited and monitored for any issues. This sounds obvious, but we've seen in several instances in which maybe there's one configuration that's missing that's not allowing systems to get the cash or the money that they should be getting. And this is something that needs to get audited and monitored constantly. So now you have the parking side figured out. How do we make sure that everything is connected to other uses of a curb? We need to talk about safety. It's really, really important. Nick talked about everything and the more than options that we have for micromobility, scooters, bikes, Uber, Lyft. We have seen an increase in deliveries. We need to make sure that all of those, and plus all the usual users from the curb, such as pedestrians, they can work together in a safe way. We also have the productivity part. All the users mentioned, they also need to interact with transit and drivers, and they all need to work in conjunction to make sure that curb management needs have consideration and provide space for everyone. And again, the economic activity. At the end, the curb space is valuable for its convenience. It's ideal for locations, for deliveries, for pickup options. It's a high turnover and high demand space that provides a lot of economic value for cities. So some of the things that can be considered in order to do some of these things is that you need to make sure that the curb needs to allow for multimodal integration. You need to make sure that you can optimize transit hubs. You need to have options for smart freight delivery zones to optimize access, turnover, and compliance, and connect curb space with technology to monitor real-time occupancy and availability. So in order to create a new curb management plan, some of the things that need to be implemented have to be part from the technology and the policy side. So for technology, it's really important to start thinking about vehicle-to-vehicle communication. With more connected vehicles, there's a need to invest in that technology from both parts. You need to make sure to invest on the curb infrastructure that can relay information to the users, gather data, connect to all the vehicles. And the technology is out there from the vendors. You also need to offer mobile payment options, sensors that can provide real-time occupancy data, smart base stations, and parking applications for analyzing data. But at the same time, for all the new technology that you implement, you also need to require and have some changes in policy. New technologies allow you to get more data from vehicles and users, and this information is going to be critical for monitoring use. But at the same time, you also need to be thinking about the security side of things. You're going to have some privacy things that you're going to need to consider, and some data that an agency reporting requirements that you're going to need to develop. All these things are going to allow you to have secure data that can be managed to create protocols and parking rules and regulations that allow the system to not be abused. So talking a little bit about the future. So what comes next? What are the next things that we're seeing with parking and the curb management side? So as we talked before, autonomous vehicles are on the way, and curbs are going to be even more important in the future, as you're going to have vehicles that are going to drop you off in the best location for you. If you think now an airport gets crazy with all the Ubers and Lyfts, just imagine when the vehicle can actually drop you wherever you want, in your office, in the grocery store. You're going to need to make sure to have that infrastructure in there. So with also the increase of demand in curb space, it's going to be really important to also provide users with real-time information on availability of parking options, and as well as integration with navigation systems. You need to tell people where there's a space so they can go quickly and they're not just going around and around or double parking. There's also a really big importance on seamless integration. If you go now to any system, you have probably 10 apps that you can use for parking, for transit, for navigation. There's really a need for seamless integration, and there are some companies already working on that. You need to have one system in which, if you're going to offer someone in a city and transportation options, that you can have that app or that application that's going to allow you to pay to plan your trips and to also gather data for you to share when distributed with others. So overall, we hope that today you can leave this presentation with just thinking that the curb space management is now needed more than ever, as we have seen in the past few months. Technology has been there for a while, but COVID-19 has been a catalyzer on how to move forward and manage curb space. We have seen the trends coming up, but with now more need to control the space, it's really important to have a robust program. So we want to thank everyone for attending, and now we would like to open the floor for any questions.
All righty. Well, thanks, Kenneth and Nick. And I did see a question come in. Let's see. I'll read that. It's actually from Chris Melson. He was stating, I've seen several cities modifying their permitting processes to allow restaurants to operate in the sidewalk limits, even shutting down roadways to traffic. I think we've all seen that. Yep. I believe some of these cities intend on retaining these changes moving forward past COVID. Would this significantly impact curb management, or are those isolated / temporary changes with relatively small impact? Kenneth, Nick?
Yeah, and I alluded to that exact question in the difficult conversations we're having with some of our clients, because you have to understand all municipalities are kind of siloed differently, but there is the parking silo, and that parking
Mhm.
silo is responsible for generating X amount of revenue per year to pay back to a general fund or pay back to a transit fund. So when you start approaching a parking entity and you say, give me X% of your assets that are revenue generating and now move them into a non-revenue generating portion, honestly, it's a challenging discussion. And that's something that needs to happen I would say that decision making needs to happen at an executive level to say, I will give up this revenue here so that I can, pass it on to some other use case. And that gets back to that point of, all right, you might not be making direct revenue out of it, but you might get indirect revenue from, more tax revenue from a business that's collecting higher restaurant fees or something like that. So there is no perfect answer, and I don't claim to have a perfect answer. Kenneth, I don't know if you had any other thing you want to share on that.
No, I think it's important to say, like, we're talking like the curb, it has so many different players and they all need to work together to find what's the best
Agree.
solution. So
That's a good question though.
No, I think maybe it's just going to be a kind of watch and see, and I think it's really it's going to be interesting to see. I know it's luckily I think been a small portion of cities giving up their real estate, but that's a good question, Chris. Paul Gilliam also had a question, asked, how does micromobility play into this? Do we need to start thinking about e-scooter lanes, etc.?
Yeah, and that's another interesting one. So early on, forget COVID. Early on, scooters were getting rolled out across city after city,
and drop them overnight, right?
Yeah, and there was a couple instances where there's actually parking companies that said, oh, we have all the makings of charging someone for the use of a particular space. So there were a couple mobile parking companies out there that said, all right, let's just connect into the scooters API, and we know where all the scooters are. So if a scooter dwells on a public sidewalk, because you can geofence that off and say, all right, scooter, this block of scooters has been dwelling on this sidewalk for more than 10 hours. Okay, turn on the clock and start charging that scooter company per minute or per hour for the scooters that are dwelled on their sidewalk. And so part of that also incentivized the scooter companies to reposition their scooters in the right zones. But it also helped, all the cities everywhere were trying to say, they're dumping scooters on our streets. We're not able to collect any revenue from that. It's causing clutter. So that actually helped kind of incentivize the scooter companies and also then gave a little bit of extra cash in the city's pocket. The lanes thing, it's a tough question. It goes back to that point of like, all right, you have this revenue generating asset. What do you want to give up on that asset? And can you give up on that? And is your city content with saying, let's give up X thousands of dollars of revenue generation for giving someone this benefit?
I hadn't thought about the revenue generation from the parking. That's really interesting, Nick. And I know with the e-scooters, it seemed to be like, where should they ride? Should they be on the curb? Should they be in the road? Should they be in a bike lane? Or should they just be gone? So that's some really interesting questions. Well, thank you, Nick and Kenneth. Appreciate y'all's time today, and thank you all for the questions. All right, and with that, we will keep our train here moving. And our next presentation is NC Transit Cares, Innovative Responses to the COVID-19 Crisis. This presentation will be given by Morven MacLean and Rachel Gaylord-Miles and I'll read a little bit about each of them. Morven is a project manager with Transit and Rail Technical Center at WSP. Her experience ranges from planning for transit technology integration projects to planning and delivery of large capital, rail, and transit projects. Morven is a native of Scotland with a degree in undergraduate Scottish law. Very cool. Rachel is a transit planner focusing on multimodal transportation, transit, and rail projects with years of stakeholder and community engagement and experience. She has served as a lead planner on a variety of projects, including transit alternative analysis studies, corridor studies, and long-range planning. Rachel is currently focusing on bus rapid transit project in the Triangle. She received a bachelor's degree in geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And with that, I will hand it over to Morven and Rachel.
Thank you, France. Welcome, everyone. I am Rachel Gaylord-Miles, and along with Morven MacLean, both from WSP, we're going to tell you about the North Carolina Transit Cares project that we've worked on for the past year that has focused on COVID-19 impacts to transit agencies here in North Carolina and developing innovative ideas to aid in their recovery efforts. So the North Carolina Transit Cares Initiative was started by NCDOT to study a wide range of innovations for transit agencies. And 1 month in, COVID-19 hit and the project shifted to focus on the impacts of COVID-19 on transit agencies here in North Carolina. The project focused on long-term and permanent impacts experienced by agencies in the areas of safety, ridership, funding and revenues, and also service. NC Transit Cares helped to identify both existing and new innovations and strategies to help respond to these impacts and help with recovery efforts. So through surveys and interactive virtual meetings, NCDOT engaged all North Carolina transit agencies and other key stakeholders such as MPOs and RPOs in a focused process to help identify COVID-19 impacts and innovative responses. So I'll note that in North Carolina, we have 98 transit agencies across the state and about 60, so a majority are rural agencies. And so from our engagement early on at the beginning of the project, we developed some key goals that included validating COVID-19 impacts in order to make sure we understood the top issues facing agencies. We also heard from agencies that they wanted a repository of information that was easily accessible. So there's a goal to promote networking and information exchange. We also developed a priority list of new or promising innovations and strategies that warranted further action that we had studied during the project. And then also we wanted to build upon the DOT's Public Transportation Strategic Plan from 2018. And so I want to take a moment to highlight some of our stakeholder engagement that was part of this project. You know, we had one kickoff meeting in February of 2020, and then as COVID hit, as many things did, everything shifted online. And even with 100+ participants at our meetings, we were able to utilize some online platforms and tools that would help facilitate small group discussions and gather feedback from agencies. We were able to utilize some tools such as Miro, which is seen on the screen now, to help capture and refine feedback in real time during those meetings. So during the Transit Cares project, we had 4 key milestones that you see here, with the first being to understand those challenges that were facing transit agencies during COVID, and also asking what innovations they were most interested in learning more about through this project. And so then at our Kick It Off meeting in July of 2020, we generated those top challenges and innovations building on that survey that we sent out. And then in the fall, in September, at our Work On It meeting, we presented all those ideas on different innovations to study further and had the agencies vote on their top ones. And then at the Launch It meeting in November of 2020, we presented action plans for those innovations. And the next the next slides, we'll talk a little bit more about each of those milestones. So again, our first milestone was to survey all 98 agencies to ask about the impacts of COVID-19, how they were responding, and what innovations they wanted to learn more about. So, you know, we asked about immediate impacts of COVID-19, which, like many agencies across the country, included reduction in ridership and revenue. We also heard from agencies that a lot of destinations were closing, and a lot of these agencies served community colleges and medical centers. So when those schools closed or medical appointments went virtual, this eliminated a lot of regular trips for agencies. In asking agencies how they adapted to COVID-19, we heard that many were doing health screenings before trips. Some created automated phone messages to remind passengers that they should wear masks and social distance during their trips. And then some also adapted by providing new services, We heard from several transit agencies that they were able to partner with other organizations in their community to deliver meals to senior citizens and homebound individuals, which kept local food programs running, but then also allowed agencies to keep drivers employed while many other agencies were furloughing drivers. The challenges that many agencies were facing included the need for more vehicles and drivers just due to social distancing requirements and having fewer riders per vehicle. And again, the reduced ridership and revenues was a challenge, along with increased cleaning and sanitizing costs. And then wanting to know what innovations they were interested in learning more about during the project, that included new scheduling technologies, being able to do that online or through an app, and also understanding some of these best practices about cleaning and sanitizing, hearing a lot of different news stories and different sources from those, and then also displaying information in real time to passengers. So at our Kick It Off meeting, which was our first one in the summer, has had all agencies in attendance. We had over 100 participants, and prior to the meeting, we were able to assign each participant to a breakout room ahead of time so that we had the opportunity to hear from all agencies. These breakout sessions had about 12 to 15 people per group with a facilitator and a dedicated note taker. And so this was a big brainstorming session to come up with any and all ideas that we would work to refine later on during the project. And this Kick It Off meeting built upon the survey that we had previously sent out to agencies and asking about the challenges they were facing, what they were doing that was innovative, and again, what innovations they wanted to learn more about over the course of the project. And so from the Kick It Off meeting and that survey, there was 4 top challenges that emerged to help shape our work going forward. And those top challenges included how to keep passengers and employees safe, how to offset declines in ridership, how to restore lost revenue and funding, and then also how do they adapt to new service patterns as their needs evolve. And so after the Kick It Off meeting, we compiled input from that meeting and the survey to develop a list of 18 innovations. We had 4 to 5 innovations per challenge and presented those to the agencies at the Work On It meeting. And at that meeting, we explained what the goals and actions of each of those innovations could be and asked for their feedback again using Miro, seen here again. And at that meeting, everyone then voted on their top 2 innovations for each challenge. And so with those 4 challenges, we came up with top 2 innovations for each challenge that came out of the Work On It meeting. And these are the innovations that we developed implementation plans for. And so now I'll turn it over to Morven MacLean, who will walk you through the goals and actions for those implementation plans.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. So the first innovation we'll talk about is in this category of safety. So how do we keep our passengers and operators safe? And this is to work to improve indoor air management in our transit vehicles and facilities. So how can we improve airflow patterns, how efficiently the air is filtered, and then how fresh air or outdoor air can be used to reduce the risk of COVID-19 transmission. And as you see in this graphic, increasing airflow in transit vehicles is one of the actions taken in concert with masking and reduction in occupancy, which can reduce the risk of COVID-19 and other infectious diseases. So one of the actions needed to meet this goal is to perform research on how airflow works within transit vehicles. And we now know from detailed airflow studies that the movement of infected air particles due to the HVAC system and a lack of ventilation can directly cause the spread of COVID-19. So the model you see here is of a restaurant early in the pandemic. So this was before masking was prevalent. And the HVAC systems essentially dragged infected particles from one person across the faces of the patrons at the adjacent tables, taken into return on the wall, and then without any filtration or ventilation, returned to stay in that same area. So unfortunately, those sitting at the tables in the orange and the red zones here all contracted COVID-19. So, but if we study how this is working on transit vehicles, we think if the airflow is, for example, taken directly upward towards the ceiling or the roof of a transit vehicle, and then filtered through a HEPA or other type filter, before it's recirculated back into the vehicle. This, we think, will greatly improve conditions. Another recommended action that came out of the study was to develop practical how-to guides for transit agencies to give to their operators. And this would tell them how to set their HVAC systems on board their buses, how to open and close windows to maximize ventilation and airflow. And Rachel will talk a little further on the research and the fieldwork that we did to develop these guides in a section on implementation at the end of our presentation today. The second innovation, still within the safety category, was to establish a transit health and safety accreditation program. So many of the agencies right at the beginning of our work at the Kick It Off meeting were really struggling with wading through the scientific information and guidance that was out there, just the volume of it, that it was changing. And this innovation was helped by clarifying and streamlining health guidance around the conditions for elevated transmission of COVID, and then how various safety measures could play a role in reducing that transmission. So we developed and held in February of this year a COVID-19 webinar for North Carolina transit agencies. And we did this in partnership with the UNC Gillings School of Public Health. And we really tried to tailor the program to the needs of the transit agencies specifically, and then leave them with an actionable safety plan. So we'll now take a look at innovations to respond to the second challenge facing North Carolina transit, and that is how to restore ridership lost as a result of the pandemic. And so the first idea here was to develop an NC Transit Cares strategic marketing effort to rebuild trust in public transportation services. So this would involve cataloging current best practice ideas that we see in our state, such as installing driver barriers, reducing ridership on routes to avoid crowded buses, and some enhanced cleaning. And then also this innovation would research national best practices to ultimately create a pilot program marketing NC Transit statewide. And the actions needed to meet this goal could be for NCDOT to create graphics and content for the agencies to use. Part of this could be to perform market research to really understand and address specific rider concerns. And then also addressing how to reach underserved communities. This was expressed by the agencies in the studies as a critical need, and possibly creating a marketing toolkit for hard to reach communities is always difficult, but it's been especially difficult during the pandemic. And then overall, longer term, the goal here is to really increase and sustain demand for North Carolina transit by exploring development of a pilot program to provide the transit agencies marketing assistance and stand up a statewide campaign. Then the second innovation in this category is to create a mobile app for transit riders that can be used for many functions. It can be used for trip planning, purchasing your fare, real-time bus tracking, and possibly the ability to see how full a vehicle is before boarding. So that helps with managing COVID-19 social distancing requirements, and then also just helps the rider feel more secure and aware of how crowded or the lack of crowding on board their vehicle. So actions needed for this goal would be to establish a technology working group to identify the key needs and develop recommendations for the app functions. And critically important to this task is really surveying the large number of transit agencies and what is needed from the app for their specific operations, as there won't be one size fit all due to the range and types of services that North Carolina transit agencies provide. Another needed item would be to conduct a peer review of systems. Some are already piloting, deploying their own apps, so we would want to complement those efforts. And then complete a feasibility study to create a statewide technology implementation plan, looking at costs and a schedule to implement that. So the third challenge that came up in our study was how to restore revenues and lost funding as a result of the pandemic. Some of the impacts have been offset by CARES Act funding, but the goal here is to really look both at current and then try to project out to longer range funding needs. Actions here are to build a funding work group with subcommittees per system type. We have urban, small urban, and then rural community systems, as Rachel mentioned, to really focus on COVID-related transit impacts and then to research and identify new potential funding sources. The second idea responding to this funding challenge was to really assess how NCDOT currently collects data from the agencies and begin to move to a common statewide data collection system. And the goal here is really that if North Carolina Transit is challenged by future disruptions, then NCDOT would have a comprehensive data source that they could quickly and easily pull data from to really show impact to operations, show the impacts of funding decisions, and really advocate for funding for transit services. Looking at the last challenge, challenge 4, this is how do we move to new service models as passenger needs change and evolve? And the goal here is to move towards statewide technology deployment and integration to make transit services more responsive to passenger travel needs. And one goal is to create a baseline inventory of statewide transit technologies to really understand what all of those 98 agencies are currently using to meet service demands, and then identify the technologies that are going to best help with the service impacts we've seen as a result of COVID, how that's changed and shaped the way people need to travel and move. So for example, new and improved scheduling software is one idea, and then really develop an action plan to advance the most promising technologies. So actions here are to target the areas of need with pilot programs, which is one of the things that NCDOT does tremendously well. And one example is the Mobility for All pilot that's happening in northeastern North Carolina now, where NCDOT is piloting a program which coordinates medical trips with transit trips. So when a passenger books a hospital or a doctor appointment, they're then able to book their ride to and from that appointment in a seamless manner. And then our second idea in this challenge is to begin to move to a statewide deployment of microtransit by expanding another pilot project in Eastern North Carolina. And you may have heard about the City of Wilson project. This was covered in a technical session yesterday afternoon. NCDOT won an Accelerated Innovative Mobility Grant for the City of Wilson. And the cities really effectively replaced their underperforming and expensive fixed route transit system with rideshare or microtransit services, which are provided through an agreement with VIA. So the city residents now call for a ride rather than taking the bus. So actions here would be to survey the agencies statewide to determine their level of interest in participating in a microtransit pilot and really understand what would be their service needs and uses. Perhaps they're looking at increased access for disabled populations or to improve their first and last mile connections. Can really communicate the lessons learned from the City of Wilson deployment, which is currently going really well, and then develop a plan to help additional systems take on their own microtransit pilot projects. And I will turn it back to Rachel.
Thanks, Morven. So I am going to show you some of the things that we were able to accomplish following our launch meeting in November 2020. We focused on safety innovations as those were of utmost importance to both NCDOT and the agencies. And so our first task was to create an HVAC technology reference guide, which highlights different indoor air management technologies that are on the market and discuss their application, how they work, and important considerations for agencies before they were buying these technologies. Agencies were seeing lots of technologies being advertised, help with indoor air management on their vehicles. So this provides information on many different technologies so that they can make informed decisions before purchasing. Another task that we had was to create how-to guides on air management in common North Carolina transit vehicles. So we've produced 2 guides, one for an LTV and one for a raised roof van. And this guide shows how to reduce the spread of airborne viruses, including COVID-19, on typical vehicles by optimizing the HVAC control settings, by opening and closing certain windows, by designating ideal passenger seating locations. And so we produced diagrams like the one shown on the screen to show how air would move through the vehicle, where passengers should be sitting, and how to adjust the HVAC controls. And this was great. It was a no-cost option that agencies and operators could implement immediately. And the picture on the screen is us testing these different configurations using small amounts of smoke to study where and how quickly that smoke moves through the vehicles. And as Morven mentioned earlier, we held a COVID-19 safety health webinar featuring speakers from UNC Gillings School of Public Health and the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. This project allowed the NCDOT to build partnerships with these organizations and gave the agencies the opportunity to hear from respected organizations who are leading the response to COVID-19. UNC has been at the forefront of COVID-19 research and was able to talk about the science of the virus. And then NCDHHS was able to provide up-to-date information on vaccines and encourage agencies to get their staff vaccinated. And so then as a leave behind, as part of the webinar, we produced this action plan that reminded agencies of what they could do to help keep passengers safe, with links to additional information and those guides that we had previously produced. And so that was a lot to take in, and we're happy to take any questions.
All right, well, thank you, Morven. Thank you, Rachel. And I also want to say thank you for the work you've done in trying to keep transit riders safe. It's great. I really enjoyed that leave behind, kind of reading some of those. All right, first question is, do you know which agencies or communities were surveyed to determine interest in microtransit service? And do you know how this outreach occurred?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, we don't have the answer to that. That'll be happening in the technology working group. It's still evolving, so I'd have to defer that to NCDOT for further information. But I do know that outreach is underway, and NCDOT meets, I think, bi-weekly. They have an all agencies call. So I'm sure they're discussing it, and I'm sure they'll get a good level of interest in moving that pilot to other areas of the state.
Thank you all for that question. Any other questions from the audience before? Feel free to raise your hand with a little virtual. If not, I'll ask one while we have some time for other people to come up with some. I really liked your interesting graphic of the airflow at the restaurants. It was good to see and kind of scary. I know COVID has created a negative impact on transit ridership. We've all heard and seen that. What do you see as something positive that will come out of COVID? Maybe it's improvements in usage of transit technology, or even maybe the increase in microtransit. I'm always the type of person that's looking for a positive anything. So what would you kind of see maybe as a positive out of COVID for transit?
Right. Yeah. I mean, a couple of ideas come to mind. And I will say that graphic, Franz, was actually a video. So I was just too nervous to embed it in the presentation. But it's even scarier because you see the red infected particles and then you see them gradually build and get recirculated. So we can share that another time. I think there's going to be a lot of changes. I think vehicle design is going to change in ways that that's really sort of going to be the frontier, I think, of some of this response to COVID. You know, that airflow management that we're talking about. So looking at subway cars, light rail vehicles, buses, you know, the concept of transit is to pack as many people as you can in, right, to one vehicle and get them, which now in this new world, we've got to sort of rethink that. So I think some of the items that I talked about, like I see the transit vehicle manufacturers really looking at airflow. Let's not take it across all the passenger spaces.
Yeah, the upward airflow you said, right? Okay.
Right. Yes. Yep. And to do that, that's another area of study where you can do CFD modeling and really understand what's happening and then redirect the airflow upward. Will transit vehicles have more efficient filtration systems? Part of that technology guide that Rachel mentioned, we sort of dove into that because there's a number of products that vendors are really pushing. Some of them are effective and some of them are not. So we had recommended and ones to avoid. So I think those two, I look forward to seeing how design of facilities and vehicles changes in the future. Rachel, you have anything to add to that one?
And I think some of the partnerships that emerged, I think people within the community really reached out and, you know, found ways that transit could serve them during these new times. Again, we saw food banks and community food organizations using transit as a way to deliver meals that may have otherwise gone undelivered. And so I think there were some great community partnerships established during COVID that will remain.
All right. As I just typed in the chat, is there any other questions for all of our fantastic speakers today? I know it's always a challenge to ask questions virtually. It's not as easy as when we're at a conference and you can just kind of raise your hand and get that good interaction. But I think we definitely had some good questions from the audience. So, and definitely want to thank, again, all of our speakers today. I think you all did a great job. Chris, Nick, Kenneth, Morven, and Rachel, thank you all. Definitely glad we didn't have any technology hiccups. So that's always a win and nowadays. So, all right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So if anything, I will let everybody go 8 minutes early. So once again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thanks to our technical session sponsor, AECOM. And then thank you to our SDITE host, Graham Malone, for helping us in case we did have issues. So everybody enjoy the rest of your conference and the rest of your day.